President Trump wants Jerome Powell out now. And while he's not wrong about Powell's mistakes, calling for a rate cut today is just as flawed. Inflation isn't under control, and the Fed is stuck between politics, pressure, and bad policy. This isn't just a Trump versus Powell story. It's proof that everyone is missing the bigger picture. Stick around because at the end, we'll tell you what should happen next and why the market is already signaling what comes next if Washington keeps getting it wrong.
Thing number 5, President Trump wants Chairman Powell out now. You're saying why everyone is wrong. What does that mean?
Yeah, everyone involved here is wrong. So we talked earlier in this episode about Chairman Powell speaking in public on Wednesday and criticizing the Trump tariffs and, being very negative on the economy and making it clear the Federal Reserve wasn't going to bail out the stock market. Well, it only took President Trump one day to criticize Chairman Powell in public for being too late and wrong, and wrote that, quote, Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. He also made allegations that Chairman Powell has been making policy decisions based on politics, something the Fed is not supposed to do. Well, guess what, Rob? President Trump is right. Powell's done a horrible job. He left interest rates far too low and for far too long after the great financial crisis. I get why he dropped rates. Sorry, not just him. It was Bernanke who dropped rates, but when Powell took over, the Federal Reserve kept rates far too low. They should have raised rates much sooner. And then, by the way, if you hate income inequality, it's the Fed's loose money policies that were huge contributors to that. Powell was also too late in raising rates when inflation picked up in 2021. In November of 21, DKI put out a white paper explaining that inflation was a gigantic problem. It was not transitory. And, we told people at the time in 2021, buy gold, buy Bitcoin, buy energy. Those all worked incredibly well. In the meantime, Powell was laconically calling inflation transitory and waited months and months before starting to raise the Fed funds rate. When he did it too slowly. And so, I spent all of last summer saying Powell should not cut rates, and that if he did, he was going to end up regretting it. And here's what happened. Last September, the Federal Reserve started to cut rates, and they cut in September, October, November. And, I pointed out ahead of time and at that time that it gave the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to be a nonpartisan institution, the appearance of playing politics. What they were trying to do was support the Democrats in office. Everybody at the Federal Reserve despises President Trump. And so they hoped that by lowering the Fed funds rate, they would spur the economy and maybe give the Democrats a lift going into the November election. Well, not only didn't that happen, but when they cut rates, the bond market started to price in higher expected future inflation and raised the yield on the 10-year. So Powell lowered the overnight rate by 100 basis points. That's 1%. And the bond market raised the yield on the 10-year by 100 basis points, uninverting the yield curve. That wasn't the way they wanted to uninvert it, right? They wanted to bring the low end down and have the high end come down more. They got the opposite. Powell was wrong on that. They gave the appearance of looking like a political actor, and President Trump was 100% right in his comments criticizing Chairman Powell.
Gary, so lots to unpack there. I have lots of questions. Where do you side on this issue? Are you with President Trump? Should he replace Chairman Powell early? I know Trump, there's been some rumblings about wanting and putting some pressure for lower cuts, but isn't that kind of two-faced, right? Considering he's saying Powell is doing the same thing during the November elections. Break that down for me if you don't mind.
All right. So for the Democrats in the audience, if you guys have not tuned out, I'm glad you're here because this section is for you. While President Trump is right that the Fed has made massive policy errors and does appear to be a political actor trying to help the Democrats, the president now wants the Fed to cut rates, and that's a bad idea. See, Democrats, I told you we were going to be here for you. Powell was wrong to cut in September, and Trump is wrong to insist on rate cuts now. While the CPI was down last month, inflation is not under control. Concerns about that potential tariffs will raise the price index, they're legitimate. Even if I think they don't necessarily lead to long-term inflation, you could have a temporary spike, and it is something that that we should be looking for. But Rob, my biggest concern on this is that unless Congress reduces spending, which is something they're not going to do, there's not much the Fed can do to help the White House. And, we were just talking about this before. When the Fed cut rates in September, the yield on the 10-year Treasury rose because the bond market priced in higher future inflation. So imagine that. Remember, prior Treasury Secretary Yellen left current Treasury Secretary Bessent a gigantic problem. Bessent has to refinance $7 trillion over the next 12 months. That is a huge number and desperately needs lower yields on treasuries to do that. So if President Trump gets his way, and gets to fire Powell, put his own pick in place. His pick then reduces rates. Guess what? We're going to end up with higher long-term rates. That is exactly what Secretary Bessent, President Trump's cabinet member, that's what Bessent is desperately trying to avoid. Basically, if Trump gets his way, he ends up pursuing a course of action that makes his policy goals less likely. Jerome Powell should ignore the president. And my verdict on this, in this matter, everybody involved is wrong.
All right. Gary plays Switzerland. We'll be right in the middle, but I agree with you, Gary. I love it. Hopefully, again, the Democrats held on for the last half of that segment. But if they didn't, please, I hope we should have told them this at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Please leave a comment, ask us a question, thumbs up, thumbs down, share. Tell us we're not very, very smart, but please just make sure that you tell us why, because is one of Gary's favorite words out there.
There you go.
All right. We haven't forgot about the educational thing. One thing real quick, head to deepknowledgeinvesting.com, grab a free subscription, sign up with your email. That'll get you added to our email list. You'll get notified of content, especially the 5 things that gets delivered. You'll also see other content. It may be paywalled though, depending on whether or not that content is for premium subscribers or not. Premium subscriptions, $100 a month. That'll get you access to everything you could possibly imagine.